I went to a lecture this morning on something that I just thought was really, really interesting about how to learn languages, learning languages more broadly, and it made me think about, well, it made me think about a lot of things, honestly, but the way that we learn languages, the way that we go through them, the way that we connect with each other, and how we actually communicate with one another through language, and how important it is to understand culture and cues and intonation and everything else. So I'm going to talk a little bit and just kind of muse about language and about its importance and some of the stuff I'm working on. So anyone who's watched any of my videos thus far has heard me at least mention, if not in some places, quote Hebrew. So I'm trying to learn Hebrew. And I'm trying to learn Hebrew because I want to understand the language that God chose to use to reveal himself to mankind at the first, right? Now, all the translations and whatever language you have that you know or that you speak as your primary native tongue, like, is awesome, and God speaks through translation as well. But there's something interesting to me and really compelling about the idea of learning the language that the God of the ages used when he first spoke with man. And that language is Hebrew. Ancient Hebrew, specifically. And this is just mind-boggling to think that, one, that God would bother to speak any human language at all is already crazy. It's like, why speak a human language? He doesn't need to, he doesn't have to. He could just like speak through impressions in people's minds. If anyone's ever read the Wheel of Time series, the wolves in that, they speak through a series of like images and sensations and all these other kinds of things. And God could have revealed himself in that way. He could have revealed himself through smells or through some sort of specific visual image. But no, he communicates through, in this case, a human language to a chosen people. And that human language that he uses is Hebrew. Now, much later, he's using Aramaic and Greek in the New Testament in order to speak with his people. But the first language that he uses to speak to man that we have recorded is Hebrew. So that's why I'm just fascinated with trying to learn this language and trying to understand the language and the culture behind the language, so that I can better understand the things that God is trying to say to us and has said to us. And it's easy to get caught up in this in some sort of academic only kind of way. And the fact that modern Hebrew was kind of built from ancient Hebrew and therefore shares a bunch of sound systems and similarities that allow you to kind of do both side by side is an immense blessing. But I don't want this to be just about the aspect of the intellectual. There is a sense in which the language you speak in your native tongue, and that language has a connection to you that other languages do not. And we're always growing in language learning, and we're always growing in language understanding. But this language that God used, Hebrew, seems to me to be something that's worth studying. It's worth delving into. And while I'll never be able to answer the question of why Hebrew versus any other language, just the fact that it was Hebrew that he chose to speak to this people, like, and that it was the Hebrews who he chose at the very beginning is really, really interesting. And while I am myself a Gentile, right, I'm not Jewish, and I didn't receive the law in that way, I'm fascinated by kind of returning to the roots, because I think we have this tendency in our society today, and in the church specifically, to not consider the language as being so important. And sometimes we flippantly throw around a little bit of Hebrew or a little bit of Greek, and we do so to try to sound more intellectual or more capable when we're talking about the Bible, but we're not diving into the language to the point where we really understand its beauty and what it's trying to convey to us about the nature of God. And there's so many ways that we can think about language, but language is about communicating, it's about connecting, it's about relationships. And I think that's what a lot of people miss when they're trying to learn a language, or when even using their own native language. They think that language is just about conveying ideas. But it's more than that. It's about a connection, a deep connection between peoples, between speaker and listener. And in order for us to have that deep connection, we need to understand a lot of layers and how different words have come into being and how they have in common usage. And so much of that is kind of implicit and sitting behind our everyday discourse. So while I'm trying to learn Hebrew, trying to understand Hebrew, what it feels like is that I'm also trying to kind of understand a culture through which God established many cultural mores and systems that were directly meant to reflect Him. So the way that marriages are conducted, the way that worship is conducted, the way that feasts and festivals are conducted, these are all things that are part of the culture, that are baked into the language, but are also reflective of who God is, in a way in Hebrew that it is not necessarily in other languages, because of the close proximity between the Hebrew language and God's first speaking to man. And one of the primaries here that I'll touch on just briefly is shalom. So again, I've said before, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, I'm not the foremost expert on Hebrew culture or language. But this idea of shalom has really stuck in my head. And shalom means peace. But it has more than just this notion of, calm or quiet. Like, it is a real peace. Peace between people. Peace is a relational term, right? Peace between people. Peace connecting across different areas. Unity. Peace is about more than just this calm, but is also about a harmony of apparent opposites and of different styles and dimensions. So shalom is at the core of so much of the Hebrew language, even to where, like, if I say, hello, how are you? Like, literally it's what's your peace. So ma shlomech or ma shlomcha, right, whether you're a man or a woman, is what's your peace, right? Saying how are you is what's your peace. And peace is the central figure in the way that the language is constructed. Similar to, like, I live in Hawaii, aloha is a kind of central idea to the construction of the language and the way that people communicate. Aloha being this kind of this force, this presence, and I don't want to be too new agey about this, right? But in Hebrew, it's about peace, it's about shalom. And when we look at the Hebrew Old Testament law, specifically the civil law, we realize over and over again that the law that is given to the people of God has a primary purpose of peace. It is primarily for the purpose of peace. for the purpose of peace, these laws are in place. Like all of the laws under the Old Testament, in the civil law specifically, are surrounding this idea of peace, of shalom, of restoring peace to the community, to live at peace with one another, with one's environment, with one's society of people, but also with oneself and ultimately with one's God. Peace is central as a figure in the Old Testament law. And it's central as an idea in the Hebrew language. And we use peace in English, and peace has kind of almost like an emotional connotation in English, like, oh, I feel peace, like I feel at ease, right? We use it as comfort language, but it's deeper than that. Peace is deeper than that. It's a restfulness. The author of Hebrews later in the New Testament talks about a rest that we can enter into, and that restfulness, that is also tied to peace. So as I was getting this lecture this morning, and these concepts of language and of peace and of Hebrew, like I'm trying to pull together all of these threads to try to understand a little bit more about who God is. Why does he choose Hebrew? And why does he help the Hebrews shape their own language so centrally along the lines of him? And how is the culture and the language reflective of him in that original, in the Hebrew text? And then I guess the next question that I would need to raise and answer and try to work through is then why Greek? Why Koine Greek for the New Testament? What is it about that language, about its structures, about its usages, about its grammar even, that may be reflective of something more beautiful and more broad and both more broad and more specific about God's character? Because he reveals himself not only in the words he speaks, but in the language that he speaks them in, the construct of that language and the images of that language, and in the analogies of that culture. And we see that time and time again in the way that Jesus uses the analogies that his hearers would have known through their space in the culture of that day, of Jesus' day. He uses those to help clarify things, to demonstrate that everything that exists is revelatory of God. But certain things, in the case of the Word of God, and specifically the Word of God given in Hebrew and in Greek and in Aramaic, for those portions that are in Aramaic, it's not enough just to think about the words themselves and basic grammar and function. It's important also to ask the question, why those languages? What is it about the structure and the form of those languages that may also reveal to us things about our great God? So I challenge you to explore a little bit, dabble in Hebrew, dabble in Greek. Be careful not to make too strong of claims based on your small dabbling. But I have a strong suspicion, and I think it continues to be reinforced as I continue to learn these biblical languages and the biblical text, that those languages were chosen for a reason, and that there is something in the language itself that is reflective of truths about who God is. And those are things that we need to pull out, and many have over the course of history, but that we need to take the time to start delving into ourselves as well. So thanks for listening. I'm going to shut this off and head out and surf for a bit.